Allaire is a member of the Jericho Conservation Commission. I know Allaire through some of our work together with the Vermont Land Trust. She has a very formal title, Ecology and Restoration Program Director. At least that's what the website says. Maybe you can explain exactly what that's all about. And thank you for being here. And thank you for figuring out how you can do something.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see if it works.
All right.
Thanks, Livy.
Thank you.
So, thank you, Livy, for the introduction. So my name is Allaire Diamond. I know a bunch of you. I don't know I don't know everybody, but I am a Jericho Underhill resident, huge supporter of Jericho Underhill Land Trust, although I'm not a member, should be. And I am, just as Livy said, the Ecology and Restoration Program Director at Vermont Land Trust. I've worked at Vermont Land Trust for about 12 years. And in that time, I have really grown to love and appreciate beavers. My work takes me all over the state. I work statewide doing ecological assessments. That's kind of how I started, looking at natural communities, working a lot with this sort of foundational book, Wetland, Woodland, Wildland. One of the authors, Liz Thompson, as many of you know her, I'm sure, a longtime Jericho resident. And that was a really great way to start my work. And then now I'm really working more, still doing some of that, but also just really working with Vermont Land Trust as we try to do a lot of ecological restoration around the state. So it was great to hear some of the things that JULT is having done on the lands that you've conserved, some of the buffers, invasive treatment, that kind of thing. And one thing that really is exciting me now is ecological restoration that's really centered on learning from and promoting beavers. So I'm just here, what happened? I guess I gotta keep this thing on.
It doesn't have any patience.
It does not have patience, I know, the phone. So I guess I just have to move through my presentation at a certain clip before it goes to sleep. So when I was putting this together today, I reflected in a sort of a funny way. There's not a single picture of a beaver in here, so I hope that no one was expecting to come and learn about what they do and sort of the specific fat content of their tails and that kind of thing. I actually don't know that much about that. I've read a couple of different books about beavers. I think it's fascinating, but what really interests me is the way that beavers shape Vermont, and that's what I am calling the talk. Just that as I've learned more about beavers, learning more and more about how the landscape that we live in, before the people that live here mostly now, so white settlers, descendants of white settlers came, there were just a ton more beavers here in Vermont. The landscape looked pretty different. And then beavers were originally pretty quickly trapped out by trappers. And then the wave of farmland settlement, land clearing happened that many of us are familiar with, that shaped the basic structures of the towns and the farms and the settlements that we have today in Vermont. And what was interesting to me as I learned about this is thinking about how the landscape that we really think of as iconic Vermont is a landscape that was artificially free of beavers. So beavers really are a keystone species, just like you said, and they weren't around for a certain period of time. That was the time when people came and really, massive amounts of people came, settled, and created those structures that we still see today. The towns that are in valleys, roads that go along rivers, that kind of thing. If beavers had been here and not been essentially extirpated, our landscape would have looked very different. It would have looked a lot wetter. It would have been a lot wetter. There would have been a lot more wetlands, a lot fewer just ribbony streams that we kind of think of as iconic streams today. And we would just be interacting with it in a different way. So I want to talk a little bit today about how beavers do shape our state. They shape the wetlands. They create a lot of the wetlands that we think of that are pretty iconic, and thinking about ways that beavers can continue to shape our state even further. So what I want to share today is just a bit about how beavers are really creators in our state. They create the landscapes that we know. They create wetlands. They create ecosystems. They create natural communities. They create habitats for a huge number of other species. And all of that together really provides a lot of flood and climate resilience. And so that's really an interesting thing that I like to think about in terms of how we can really rely on these beavers as partners to help our flood events be less dramatic, less damaging, to help us mitigate some of the impacts of climate change. And it's pretty exciting. This is a picture I took up in Bakersfield of an old, like a probably decades old stump that had been gnawed by a beaver. There was this amazing little terrarium of lichens and moss growing in the center of it. Just one example of just the micro creativity that they have, and they also have creativity on a large scale. So how do beavers do this? And again, I'm gonna have to read some of this to you from my phone. So beavers build dams. I think that's kind of the iconic thing they do. Another thing they do that's like maybe not quite as commonly seen or known about is that they excavate canals. It's a massive amount of effort, probably equal to or more than the dam building is actually like excavating sediment in the wetland complexes to get out to the edges of it so they can get more trees at the edge. And those turn into these like water-filled canals that have a pretty interesting impact on the wetland or the riparian, the stream system that they're in. They manage trees and shrubs by coppicing them. So coppicing is just cutting down a woody plant, and then certain species will then grow multiple stems from the roots or from the stump that has been cut. So beavers do this all the time. They do it with willows, they do it with alders, they do it with red maples, they do it with poplars. They'll manage woody plants for their food or for building materials, and then those will send up more shoots, and they're actually managing their own food and building supply, which is pretty cool. And so what happens when beavers are doing this is that they're storing the impact of the dam building is that you're creating these dams that are holding back water, they're accumulating sediment behind them. Those places are storing, they're slowing down water, and then they're also spreading water out into the bottom of the whole valley rather than just having water flowing straight through a narrow little stream channel. So that has a huge impacts or huge implications for floods. When floods come through, if they can move more slowly through a beaver system, they're just not going to have that rapid damaging impact that we've seen so much. Let me turn this for a second, read the other words that I wrote here. They reconnect groundwater and surface water to each other. So when beaver dams are storing all that water behind them, they're actually a lot of that water, is just like water that you could go and scoop up and swim around in if you were a beaver, or if it was deep enough if you were a person. But there's actually, I think it's 5 times more water is actually stored like in the ground behind a beaver dam that is really creating just a massive kind of sponge that just has a little skim of like actual fluid water on the top. But it's just, they're creating the whole valley into a massive sponge. So they're storing that, and when that is happening, that extra stored water that's beneath the ground is then connecting into groundwater that is colder, that might have been disconnected in the past because it was too low, but when there's a beaver dam, the whole area, the whole water table is raised, so groundwater is more able to reconnect to the surface, and then the water that's stored behind the beaver dams can also just eventually become groundwater. They create structural complexity, so they're cutting down trees, they're creating these canals, they're moving wood around, they're building dams. All of this is making the whole wetland system more structurally complex. So it's not just like a pipe with water moving through it, it's just like something that's really messy. And anyone who's kind of spent time in a beaver complex knows that it's like maybe hard to move around, and you have to climb around things, and you're getting wet, and then you're dry, and there's a stump, and that's all complex. And so what all that complexity does is it creates lots of interesting habitat spaces for all different species. Places for seeds to land, places for insects to breed, any number of mammals, birds can all find spaces to be in a beaver wetland. And then beaver wetlands, that activity also helps with carbon storage, sediment storage, tons of sediment builds up behind beaver dams, and with mineral nutrients and minerals. So minerals that are dissolved in groundwater can access the beaver wetland when they're connected with the groundwater. And then nutrients, so say phosphorus, which is a common agricultural pollutant. We all know, it's a natural material, but it's something that is, when there's too much of it, causes some issues. We know that that's an issue in Lake Champlain. Beaver wetlands can hold a lot of that and take it up with all the vegetation that's growing in them. So I grew up down in southern Vermont, And I used to always drive on this road called Pleasant Valley Road. And basically, if you can imagine, these are two Google images or a map from 1962, historic map, and then a Google image from 2018. So what I remember growing up is you're driving down this road, which is just this like north-south road right here, and there's just beaver dam after beaver dam after beaver dam after beaver dam. And just driving along, I would look over, and I think I counted 10. And it's pretty interesting. So I thought, what did that look like in the past? I looked up this 1962 historic imagery and found that this was all open agricultural land with a straight line going down the middle, a channelized stream that had been turned into a channel so that water could efficiently flow through and make as much land on the sides of it available for farming as possible. And what that did is kind of turn that landscape into just like a plumbing system, right? Like water was just rushing through it, going straight down. If you can see the bottom of the image, the Saxons River is right down here, rushing right into the river, which is pretty sensitive to flooding. That's what was happening then. And then I don't actually know the details, but there was a series of decisions with the landowners along here to retire that land and let some of it go back to being, allowing beavers to come back, inviting them to come back. And now we've just got like 10 beaver dams holding a ton of water behind them. It's pretty interesting. And this is just a good example for me of kind of like what we may think our landscape looks like because we didn't necessarily grow up with a lot of beavers on it. And what it looks like with beavers is just really, really different. There's just like, they can really come in and be like a very much dominant animal in certain systems. What I'm interested in today, and in just like in my work in general and in all the conversations that I'm having, is changing the search image that we all have in our minds of like what a healthy stream looks like. So when I say search image, it's just kind of like, all right, I say healthy stream, what does that mean to you? We just heard about buffer planting that happened. I think for many of us, growing up, learning about ecology a little bit, we learned, okay, there's a healthy stream, is a stream that's flowing through a landscape, and maybe it looked beautiful when you were a kid. You could imagine like a fairy tale stream that just was like flowing through an open meadow. And then as we learn a little bit more about like, yeah, we need some trees along that shades the water, it provides better habitat for fish, more habitat for animals to move in and out of the water. We think about planting a buffer along that stream and having it be a little bit more forested. That's one idea of a healthy stream. So that's a pretty good search image. But what I would like to challenge us all to do is to actually change that image even further to something that, and again, we're not going to be able to see it all because of the bottom here, to something that has a lot more messiness and complexity in it. This is a graphic from a paper on beaver ecology. And basically it's showing the evolution of a stream. So it's saying, okay, we have a stream, it's kind of like cut down or in size in a channel. Beavers come and they build a couple dams. Those dams build up sediment behind them. They have the physical nature of the wood that's in the dam is causing water coming behind it to move differently. It scours around, maybe there's a blowout and the water moves across, widening the channel. Beavers come back and adjust and they build their dams again, they fix them, they build new ones. You have more blowouts and more things that come and get in there. Maybe the stream actually splits into multiple channels that we even braid together. You're not just having that one single kind of sinuous channel winding along. And then the image down at the bottom here is really like, it almost just looks like a forest or a forested wetland that's just full of channels. You don't necessarily feel like you're walking to the stream, jumping across it, and then continuing on. You're walking through an entire complex that has like maybe 4 or 5 different channels in it. Some of them are deeper, some of them are smaller. There's areas that are just kind of spongy and wet. There might be areas that are high and dry, but it's really complex. And that's the impact of having beavers putting all of that structure into the stream. So I want to challenge all of us, this is something that I've been doing for the last couple of years, is thinking about when I see a stream that kind of has that like iconic like fairy tale look, thinking, well, it's beautiful, but maybe it's not quite the full expression of what that stream could be. If beavers really were in there, if there was a healthy, robust population, it would actually look a lot more complex, a lot more messy, might be less appealing to go wander around in, but there'd be so much more going on. It would be loud with birdsong. There'd just be tons of different things happening. And that's really what I'm kind of hoping that we'll see more. And that we'll all start to think of that as something that's beautiful and accepted and like something we want to promote rather than something that we want to clean up and fix. So I want to now take just a couple just show you a bunch of pictures of different beaver complexes that kind of show some of these ideas. And then I'm going to share a little bit of research. I just came back from BeaverCon, which was a conference of like 500 or 600 people. It was amazing. In Colorado, I have my BeaverCon t-shirt. And it was really fun. It was like a place where we really got to hear from the people who are kind of on the cutting edge of beaver biology, beaver ecology, river ecology that really focuses on beavers, restoration work, as well as promoting beaver habitat. So really excited about that. This picture is one that I took up in Bakersfield on some land that Vermont Land Trust conserved. I think it's kind of interesting because this is what I think a lot of people think of when they see a beaver wetland. They think, oh, it used to be a forest and then beavers flooded it and then all the trees died, and maybe that's a little bit sad. The way I think about that is like, okay, we have a complex and changing world all the time. Beavers are animals, they're living, they might die, their families might grow and change, they might decide a place isn't good, they might eat all the willows and alders that they like out of one place and not have enough food, they might have to move on. So beaver wetlands are really complex and dynamic. Their beavers are there for a while, then they might leave, and then they might come back, later on. There are some places, I think we could like push toward this in Vermont if we really were to promote beavers, where beavers aren't necessarily in and out all the time. They are more stable on the landscape. I'm excited to think about what that could look like and how we could get there. But I do think that this kind of view is like what a lot of people think of when they think of beavers. It's kind of like they weren't here, there was a forest, they came, they flooded it, and they changed it. And then, for whatever reason, I think that's can be negative for some people. And they want to get the beavers out so that the forest can regrow. What I see this is actually like, I think, okay, this is a big flat area. It's a depression. Water's going to be down there. It's a perfect place for beavers to come and change that wetland to be something else. There was a forest there because beavers were trapped and extirpated from the landscape. So before that forest was there was very likely a beaver complex in this site. And so when I look at it, I think of like, it's kind of going back in time a couple stages. Like, okay, now they're here. They used to not be there. They used to be there. So just kind of a fun thought exercise when I see a place like this. This picture is taken down in Dorset in an area where I worked on a dam removal project this summer. And this is drone imagery that was taken by just a really talented drone photographer. And you can kind of imagine if you've ever driven down Route 7, this is Route 7, through Dorset, where you're in that it's called the Valley of Vermont, really narrow valley where it's just like Green Mountains on both sides. The long trail is up here on the spine of the Green Mountains, and then here you're kind of moving to the west, like over toward the Taconics. Just a really cool area. There's like all these pieces of marble everywhere, and people have like front steps made out of like giant chunks of marble. So we did this dam removal up in the headwaters of the Otter Creek. This wetland here, literally there's a tiny little stream that's called the Otter Creek that comes off the Green Mountains and comes into here, and then it flows north all the way up to Lake Champlain. Emerald Lake State Park, I think, is like right here. So just to locate you. So what I wanted to show here is just that like when you have a natural depression in the land, water flows downhill, it's gonna go there, and you're gonna have a wetland there. But when beavers are there, that wetland is just gonna be a lot more interesting. It's gonna be wetter. There's gonna be a lot more going on there. So this is just this really interesting beaver wetland, Otter Creek headwater area, and I'm gonna show you a more detailed picture of it. And I just one of the points I wanna make is just that beavers do create wetlands. It's not necessarily that there wouldn't be any kind of water or wetland if they weren't there, but when they're there, there's just a lot more that's happening. This is a picture from the drone just looking straight down on that wetland complex, and I just think this is beautiful. So there's a bunch of beaver dams. There's a beaver dam right here. Water's flowing this way, this really like defined line right here. There's a beaver dam here. There's one here. I think that's a beaver dam. So really interesting to me how when you look at this, and this is the side of it. This is just like upland forest over here, upland forest here, little chunk of upland forest here because there's sort of like an island, a peninsula that goes in. But behind the dam, the dark is the water, and then all of this green, different shades of green and yellowish green is all vegetation in the wetland. And you can just see from the color, the density of it, that it varies a little bit. Like it's really yellowish and dense right here. It's kind of more diffuse over here. Here it's almost like not even there. Those are all actually different kinds of wetland areas within this wetland complex. So just the beaver dam itself, imagine like right behind it, you've got the deepest water. And then as you go back from that, it just gets shallower as that kind of scooped out area goes up to the next highest point. Then the beavers build again, and then that happens again. So all in there, there's places where there's deep water, there's places where there's cattails, there's places where there's woody plants. And imagine all the habitat and everything that's in there. One thing that I have recently been learning about, and we talked a lot about it at BeaverCon, so it's a really new hot topic that I'm bringing back, is the canals that beavers build. So I mentioned this before, but it's really cool to see on this image that you see this curved beaver dam, and then behind it, there's all these like little dark lines, right, going out. A lot of them are really straight, actually, and they go up here, they go over to the side, there's one there, this goes to the side, that goes to the side. Those are all actually literally excavated out by beavers, like digging out through the muck so they can swim over to the side of the wetland complex. So beavers are pretty awkward walking. And this at BeaverCon, there was one presentation where the presenter was like, asked who had seen a beaver. I'll do the same thing. Who has ever seen a beaver? Okay, most people. Awesome. Who has seen a beaver walking? Okay, just a couple people. Yeah, so you don't see that much because they don't walk a lot. Like they don't like to walk. It's hard for them to walk. Their bodies aren't designed to walk. So they actually dig out these canals so they can swim out to the edge of the wetland to get more wood to eat or to use for building. And the hydrological impact of those canals is actually super interesting. It's something that people haven't really been studying, but they're starting to. So that's something that I'm like just fascinated by because I'm just, as a person who's always wanting to learn, it's like, cool, what are those actually doing? So here is, I'll show you that other picture later. Just going back for a second to what's happening here? This is the picture I was looking for. Can't really see it because of the thing on the bottom, but basically this is a picture I took like low down in a beaver wetland in East Montpelier. So the beaver dam is over here, and this is one of the little canals. It just looks like a little open trail through the water. So another thing that I just find interesting about beavers is just like, how do they actually build their dams? I think when I first started learning about them, really in depth, so this was probably, 5 or 6 years ago, I thought, okay, beavers build their dams, they build them out of wood, right? We've all seen that. And thinking about these structures that are really built out of wood. As I've learned more about it, I know, I've seen and just observed when I actually see beavers, like dams that are in progress. So this is a dam that was literally 2 weeks old when I took this picture. This was taken on July 25th or 26th of this summer down in Stowe at the Ricketson Farm, which was conserved last year. It's right along Route 100, so this is an area that's like right on the right side of Route 100 as you're going north of Stowe. This had all completely washed out during the floods in early July, and then beavers quickly came back. And what I find really interesting here is like all these rocks, like these were actually moved carefully over. There was like mud and sediment that had been built up, and then all these chunks of alder wood, you can see the leaves are still on them, had been brought, and the beavers were starting to put them in kind of in putting them up against the flow of the water. So the water's flowing this way. Really interesting to see how they start to build a dam from scratch. And that has implications, I think, for our state, because we live somewhere where we have a lot of beavers here, but we're still like recovering our population. A lot of the beaver dams we see are relatively new and relatively young. Even if they've been there for a while. Beaver dams can actually persist for people have documented them that are 150 or more years old, the same dam in the same place. But in our state, just because of the land use history that we've had, there's been a lot of beaver dams that have just been younger, smaller, not as persistent because they don't get built up and they're not as strong. And they may not be maintained consistently, so they may break apart. So a lot of the dams we see they end up being these kind of young ones. At BeaverCon, this is not going to be a great picture to talk about. There's one researcher who I just like kind of idolize. Her name is Jordan Kennedy. She's an engineer who's just been super excited about beavers ever since she started doing her PhD, trying to understand how animals in groups communicate with each other and work across generations when they're not necessarily communicating like one-on-one. She studied termites and kind of the way that they engage with each other, the way they leave signals and scents for each other to work on like these giant communal projects. And beavers kind of do the same thing. So she had really shared the importance of an older, more established beaver complex and the exponentially more effective way that those complexes sit in the landscape, the way they hold water, the way they create habitat and structure, all those benefits that I was talking about before. So she was showing just, you can't really see this, but the picture on the top was like the same complex, drone imagery of it from starting in 2003 up to 2017, so 14 years. And then the bottom, you can just see that there's more white on below each of these. This is the kind of the volume of the water that was stored behind it that she mapped just like through analyzing aerial photos. So it's pretty cool. So that dam that I just showed you that just was like 2 weeks old, just is like impounding a tiny bit of water. But over time, if that complex were to be stable, it would just get so much more effective in terms of becoming this entire watery complex. People who work in kind of beaver world, they talk about the great drying of our country when beavers were large scale trapped out of not just Vermont, but many parts of the country. Our country just got drier. Like there just wasn't as much water that was staying high in the watershed. It was just all flowing down quickly to the rivers, and then those would flow to the ocean. So what we're all kind of hoping for, those of us who are sort of obsessed with beavers, is that we're going to have a great re-wetting where we can like promote more beavers, we can create more beaver habitat, we just have a wetter landscape that can just be more resilient to all of the changes that we're experiencing. Again, bad picture, but this is just like know that this is an image that was drawn in, I don't know the year, I think it was like the 1870s, by one of the first white surveyors in somewhere like Minnesota, sort of like upper Midwest Canadian border area. It's a beaver complex, and they were surveying and they drew it because it was there. And that complex is still there today, and it looks the same today. So it was really interesting to be able to have these historical like pen and ink drawings and then compare them with modern day Google Earth imagery and see that it's the same thing, and that beavers, when they have the space to do it, can create really, really long lasting complexes that just persist over time. It's not that they're coming and going and getting replaced and leaving all the time the way that we might think that, that they do kind of in Vermont because of our history. Cool beaver complex in Charlotte that I have. This is just like a introduction to this one. The more of the beaver stuff is actually behind this, but there's a dam here, and you're looking out toward Lake Champlain. This was a place where I spent a bunch of time analyzing some recent beaver activity. Oh, that's that picture of the canal I already showed you. Yeah, so this is, again, this is not great to see on the tiny screen, but this is an image of that same wetland that I just was showing you in Charlotte. This is the beaver dam here, and then I mapped out just like analyzing kind of some changes that had happened there over the last 3 or 4 years. All the beaver dams that I could see, those are these stars, so there's like 10 beaver dams, and then I also tried to map out all the canals to try to figure out what's the area of canals that's in this complex. Because it's really just cool to see the impact that these things can have. This complex went from being, when I looked at historic imagery, it was just like an old meadow, had one line going through it. Now it's this like big thing that has areas of meadow, has areas of shrubs, it has all these little streams, it has canals going out to the side. So beavers can just do this. They're creating these really complex, interesting places. Some cool history, or just some cool research that's happening. Alan Puddock is a researcher in England and Wales who has done research on the way that beaver complexes can mitigate floods. So I know this is something that we all like really care about here in Vermont, obviously. And he found that in comparing 2 different stream systems, one of which had beavers in it, one of which didn't, the way that the floods traveled through those systems was really different. So water, first of all, in the beaver complex, less water was leaving the system because a lot of it was retained behind the beaver dams and in that kind of sponge-like setting that I was describing. A lot of it did, obviously, eventually leave the system. Beaver dams are porous. Water goes through them. Water goes over them. They're totally evolved in the same way as fish. So some people think that fish and beavers are like incompatible with each other. The species evolved together, so fish can definitely navigate through beaver dams or over beaver dams. So these complexes that had the beavers, less water was going out, but it was also moving more slowly through the system. So like I was saying, we've had these really dramatic flood events where you have like a massive amount of water falling really quickly. When that pulse just pulses through the system quickly, you have huge amounts of damage. But in a beaver complex, it's going to move more slowly through because it's just going to spread out. It's going to have to go over all those dams, and it just isn't, you're not going to have as much damage downstream. So this is some interesting research that actually shows that happens. Yeah, this is just like some more language from that, but I wanted to share this picture. I don't know if anybody ever saw this beaver dam. It was only around for like 2 weeks, 2020, in the Browns River. There was a drought in the summer, and beavers were actually able to dam the entire river, and then like 2 weeks later it blew out because they were too hopeful. It's just too much water normally flowing through that system. It's just not enough. Beavers do need a certain like sweet spot of water to be able to build a dam that functions. But what I think is really interesting here is that even though that dam blew out, all the material that was in it got lodged somewhere else, right? So that creates structure in the system too. So even when the dams fail, it's a more complex system that the beavers have helped to create than if the dam was never there in the first place. You just have this like literally like a plumbing system, like I said. Another benefit that beavers can help with, I don't think we have this issue so much here in Jericho and Underhill, but one of the presenters, not at this conference, but another one I went to, is like a city planner for a city that's a suburb of Portland, Oregon, and they were dealing with like a wastewater treatment kind of constructed wetland situation that they built, where it was all constructed, engineered to be perfectly whatever, and then beavers came in, and people were pretty worried about it. They were worried that beavers were going to mess with the dynamics of that system, which was for like a pretty populated like part of Portland, the city. And there was a lot of community conversations and meetings. Beavers were taken away, and then they came back. And what folks did is actually studied it and found that the water leaving the system when the beavers were in it was cleaner than during the period when they had been taken out. And we're like, okay, this seems like it's actually working. So they were able to like integrate into even an urban setting. And that's, to me, really interesting as well. This is not a good slide for us, but it's just know that each of those little squares on there is a different type of, a different group of animals. So different taxa, so there's, birds of prey, there are macroinvertebrates, diatoms, fish, all, basically any kind of animal type that you can think of is probably benefiting in some way, whether directly or indirectly from beavers, whether it's from increased groundwater that's allowing for plants that can green up early in the spring to support animals coming out of hibernation, to just macroinvertebrates that are able to find places to be with nutrients that they need, fish that can eat those, and so forth. And I wanted to just share, this is something that's really interesting to me, as like I said, I kind of came up in Vermont with wetland within wildland, with understanding natural communities. That's kind of the way that I drive around the state and see the state and understand the landscape and feel connected to the landscape. And as I've learned more about beavers, it's actually been interesting because I think that I've looked around and I've seen that same kind of learning has been happening with a lot of my colleagues and a lot of people that are also really excited about Vermont's ecosystems and landscape. And one thing that I've been seeing is just that, I don't think we've understood just the impact that beavers can have on our landscape and the way that they create landscapes. Because as much as I absolutely adore this book and it's foundational for me and my understanding, it really doesn't even touch into the way that beavers can create some natural communities. And for example, this is a chapter about alder swamps. Says beavers like to be in alder swamps and they get food there, but they're an animal that's found in this community. And what I find, this is a photo from Cambridge, at Brewster Uplands, which is a place that, if folks aren't aware of it, it's 25 minutes from here, and it's got 7 miles of amazing walking trails. So you should go check it out. There's an incredible beaver complex full of alder swamps that are literally created by those beavers and the dams they create, the sediment behind them, and the water that impounds there. Beavers are coppicing the alders. They're helping to create the conditions for them to grow. And they're just like, they're making that landscape, which is so cool. Some other natural communities that are really important with beavers that I don't think we've understood quite so much how beavers really shape them, not just that they're sort of there once in a while, but they actually create them. Shallow emergent marshes. So these are just kind of a standard marsh that's not just like dominated by cattails. It's got a lot of different species in it. But spaces where if you didn't have beavers, you would have maybe just like sort of a meadow with a stream running through, which you can kind of imagine this might be that case. This is up in Fairfax. But instead, you've got this small stream that beavers have dammed in multiple places. And instead of having just like sort of a pasture with a stream, you have this marsh that's forming on all sides of it because the beavers have raised the water table around it enough to create the conditions for that wetland to form. Oh, this is one that I thought was interesting. This is cattail marsh, where I think like beavers aren't necessarily like super connected to cattails, because when you think about a cattail marsh, it's like usually pretty deep. But beavers do build, actually they can build dams and even use cattails in their lodges. And when I was looking through here, I was just kind of like, wow, it's so interesting. They're not even listed as an animal that is in cattail marshes. And this is a beaver complex that's like probably the closest one to where we are right here. This is over behind like Tillotson Drive or Tillotson Road, just across the street, where there's like the little neighborhood and the cul-de-sac, and then you can walk out on the trails. And there's a series of beaver dams. There's one here. This is the big like pond that's like behind like the country stores here, and we're kind of over here. The pond here, and then there's a beaver dam. There's another beaver dam. There's a series of them, and all this like purplish stuff is cattails. So cattails are obviously there's other influences too. Nutrients maybe coming off of the lawns and so forth. So cattails really respond to like nutrients. But beavers have kind of created that community in that space as well. So interesting that they just like help to shape all of these different kinds of wetlands and communities that we love. This is really cool. Kathy, this is a rich fen that I found down in East Montpelier. This is a roundleaf sundew, which was growing in it. And there were some other just like really cool, interesting plants that are unique to rich fens. So fen is a peatland. It's found in places that have mineral-rich groundwater typically. So mineral-rich meaning like usually calcium. So this area has a lot of like limestone-y kind of bedrock and calcium, and there's a little rich fen, and then right next to it was a beaver dam. I was in a whole beaver complex, and over on the edge of it was where this rare natural community was, which had a bunch of really interesting and unusual plants. So beavers can help create those conditions. Again, I think in part, I haven't seen this like written down, but I think it's because they're able to like really reconnect the groundwater to the surface water. And so these groundwater dependent communities can really form and thrive around beavers. And just want to end with a couple like stories about how we at Vermont Land Trust are incorporating beavers into our ecological restoration work. And the way I like to think about that is that we're inviting beavers to come back. They're here. There could be more of them. We want to invite them to be here in a more, just in a more welcoming way. I think like let's live with beavers. So what can we do to do that? One thing we do is we protect their habitat. So in Vermont Land Trust conservation easements, we protect all wetlands and all streams. They all have special kind of restrictions around what you can and can't do in those areas. Anything that folks do, if they're going to cut a tree or something like that, it has to be with an eye toward sort of what's the function of that wetland or that riparian area. So there usually is a restriction on like agriculture, building roads, infrastructure, and that kind of thing. So we have that language kind of baked into all of our easements. So in doing so, then we create space for beavers to be. That's one prong of our strategy. Another thing that we do, and again, these pictures are not great in this format, is that we promote coexistence with beavers. So that's a lot of just like, how do we all as humans live with beavers? And I heard, talking about some of the JULT properties earlier, it's like, okay, we want to coexist with them, that's great. However, there are times when like a beaver builds a dam and the dam impounds water that comes over a road or something like that, and there's some challenges. So there's all different strategies, and there's a whole world of people that do this. Beaver coexistence. So this is one example of it is what's called a beaver flow device. This is one that's like been trademarked. It's called a beaver deceiver that was put in up in Cambridge at the Brewster Uplands property, actually to protect like a big culvert that beavers were damming. So what it is just essentially a cage. You could see it in this photo if it wasn't blocked. A big wooden and like wire mesh cage with a culvert going into it, and then the cage prevents beavers from like damming up. So the small culvert's going into a big culvert. There's a cage around where they meet, so beavers can't get in there and block the big culvert. And then the other end of the small culvert has another cage around it. This is sitting on the water, but it's in the process of like being sunk down to the bottom of the pond. So basically it's like tricking beavers so that they're not hearing the sound of flowing water and going and building a dam at the actual culvert. They're just kind of like, water's just flowing, and they don't actually know that it's flowing because they can't hear it because of this whole little system. So beaver deceivers, beaver flow devices, this is something, are folks familiar with that? Does anybody know? There's a few of them in Jericho and Underhill. So it's kind of interesting to see these and like learn more about them. We held an event last year up at this site to just bring the public out and show them. So I'll probably do more of that. But they're pretty interesting. They all are kind of more or less custom designed. But it's basically a way that anybody who has an issue with a beaver can think about putting this culvert thing in, and then the beavers can stay, the issue goes away, everyone gets to coexist. And I'll just name right now, just for any of you, that if you, for any JULT properties where we hold the easement, or if there's other properties that you know of that are connected with Vermont Land Trust, I do have funding available to put in beaver deceivers if there's a beaver issue. So if anything comes up, we do want to help, and that's something that we're actively trying to do. So reach out to me if anything like that is present for you. And then a third prong of our restoration strategy for beavers is called just like mimicry. We mimic beavers. So in this case, we've got a crew of people who are like pounding posts into a stream, weaving willow branches around it, and basically making like a pretty inferior but still like somewhat functional beaver dam. We call it a beaver dam analog. And this is up in Sheldon on a farm, where we're trying to, you can see that this is kind of that classic stream where it's just like, it's cut down, it's incised. The side of the stream is like not really wet. The stream is not able to get out into its floodplain very much because it's cut down so much. So what we are trying to do is build a bunch of these fake beaver dams. We did about 11 or 12 of them in about a 400-foot stretch of the stream, and hoping that they would collectively slow down water, trap sediment, and then let that water come out into the floodplain to slow it down and start that whole process of creating a beaver complex. We're trying to do that. Ultimately, though, we want beavers to come back there because they do a way better job than we do as humans.
Are they coming back? I mean, are they using those?
They're not using them yet. Like we built them last year. We went out this year, and they're looking okay. The structures are looking okay, but there are not beavers there yet. But that picture that I showed, I guess I'm going the wrong direction. There was a picture I showed that had like a person working in the background, and that was from that site. So we found some old beaver chewed sticks, so we know that the beavers could be there. So we're hoping that they'll return. I skipped a slide, but it just showed that like after a year is kind of what you were asking about. After a year, some of those structures, those beaver dams had kind of blown apart in storms. Unfortunately, we're not out there 24/7 the way beaver would be to fix it and keep it like working perfectly. So they kind of blew apart, but what was cool is that we had built those structures out of live willow stakes. We just cut willow that was growing on site, used it to weave in, and those willows had actually grown into willows. So we were actually creating more beaver habitat there, more beaver food through the building of the structure. And that's what beavers do too. They often build their dams out of like live material, and then that material grows. So they're creating like their own hedges of their future food and their future building supply, which is pretty cool. Another thing that happened with those structures was that one of them blew out on one side, so the stream like went around it, but it piled up a bunch of sediment against the fake beaver dam. So that was kind of interesting too, because it was creating more complexity in the stream. So this picture is just some of the volunteers. These are a bunch of people from Franklin County. This is up in Sheldon again. Franklin County, different watershed groups that came together to learn from us at the Land Trust about how to do some of this beaver-based restoration. And my text here was just like, it's called adaptive management, going back and kind of seeing what you have to do to keep these things working. And I had just given a little report card, like beavers or people get a C, beavers get an A+. If possible, we want to create space for beavers to come in because they're going to do a much better job. We're just going to go out when we can, which is probably like once a year, not for that long. We're not going to know exactly what to do in the perfect way that beavers do. Not that they're all perfect, but collectively they do a much better job than we do. So I think really our goal is to get beavers back. We can mimic them, but we want to eventually get them. And then I started with this, and I'll end with it. The fourth part of kind of this broad restoration strategy that I have with our work at the Land Trust is just tell the story. So like, we're here tonight, I'm sharing this with you, I want to hear what your thoughts are. Tell the story of how beavers really can integrate into our landscape, and then be patient because they might come and do something quickly, but you've got to give them some time to like really have some babies and have those babies go out and build more dams and bulk up the dams that they built already until you get a pretty cool ecosystem that just has all of those benefits in it. This is a really neat site. This was one of the first river corridor projects that we worked on at the Land Trust. This was like 15 years ago. It was on a farm up in Fairfield. And it was just like an open farm ditch that I've seen pictures. It was from before my time. That's just like your standard kind of stream on a farm that's just going through an open pasture. Restoration happened, some floodplains were created, and then 15 years later, we came back this summer and found this incredible beaver complex down in there. So beavers found the site. They built up a dam that was probably like 3 or so feet high, 2.5, 3 feet high, and impounded a ton of water. Willows are growing all over the place, amazing birds, amazing moths and butterflies flying all through this space. But they didn't do it right away. And so I think as humans, we sometimes think like, despite the fact that we have been kind of messing with our landscape for hundreds of years, when we start to do restoration, we want to just like get in there and plant the tree and be like, cool, we walk away, we're done. It takes time for restoration to happen. And it takes time for beavers to come. It takes time for us to learn the best places for them to be. So I think patience is really important in this process. So that is what I wanted to share with you all. And yeah, it's just happy to share my information if anybody wants to be in touch, or just we can stay and chat for a few minutes now. But I hope that this helps folks get excited about beavers and the ways that they can like really, the way that they're being creative out on the landscape, the way we can work with them and promote them. So with that, I will open it up to any thoughts, questions, ideas, anything. Yeah.
So you're talking about Beaver Commons building up a reservoir of groundwater.
Yeah.
Eventually, it's going to get into the aquifer. How long? I mean, is that a million years or 100,000 years? Or I mean,
yeah.
It's long. I mean,
Yeah.
Are they affecting the aquifer?
I can't answer that. I mean, I think it is a long time is all I can say, but I don't know anything. I can't tell you like numbers of years. I think it really depends on the type, like what's the bedrock, what's the porousness of that rock, what are there cracks between it, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, you would have that connection kind of back and forth. You have great existing groundwater that's able to reconnect and surface in and around beaver wetlands. But then the water that's being impounded is also going to become groundwater.
Another thing I wanted to say is that a lot of people think beavers are nocturnal.
Mm-hmm.
If you leave them alone, like Susan and I have quite a bit of property along the road, maybe a half a mile.
Yeah.
And we've let them alone for 45 years.
Yeah.
And, I've canoed down the brook and come upon a corner where they're all, families sitting on like a little beach having lunch.
A family of beavers?
They look at you, they've seen you already, they don't care.
Yeah.
You lie by.
Yeah.
I mean, because you don't interfere with them. So,
Yeah.
I mean, we can actually, peripherally interact, but they are active all day long.
Oh, cool. That's really neat. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. I think that it's just, they're like a blind spot. Beavers are kind of a blind spot for a lot of people. I just did this presentation. I didn't even show a picture of a beaver. I think there aren't a lot of people who are just really observing them. And the folks that do are finding things that are super surprising. Like what you just shared, that's incredible. A family of beavers. And there's people like in, I know we did we had a talk in Jericho last year, and I don't know if anyone here was at the talk, but with Leela Phillip in this book, Beaverland. It's a great book, recommend it to anybody. There's also a book called Eager. So there's 2 recent books just about like sort of popular science about beavers. They're both excellent books. But she profiles this woman who raised beavers, and she like literally had them living in her house, like eating at the dinner table with her, and like they're domesticated, you know, like that was something that
They love apples.
it's possible. They love apples. I've heard that. I have heard that actually. That's a great story. Thank you. Yeah.
How many beavers are like some of these complexes you pointed out? Is it dozens, hundreds, thousands? How many beavers does it take to support a complex?
Yeah. So my understanding is that, you know, you see a complex that has like one big lodge, right? That's like one family. They may have an accessory lodge too, but that's like the one family with parents and their kits of that year. And then the next year, the males kind of get kicked out and they have to go somewhere else. So they would go upstream or downstream and find another place, and they might build a lodge in another spot. So if you're seeing a complex like this is the one in Cambridge I was talking about. It's got a couple lodges in it. I think it may be just one large extended family, or maybe a couple separate families. But yeah, I don't actually know like the census, kind of like how my best understanding is like parents and kits of that year, maybe females that are a little older are in the one, and then everyone else is off. So if you see a beaver like killed on the side of the road or something, it's often like a dispersing younger male, because they're the ones that do need to like move to find other spaces. But when I was at BeaverCon, somebody was talking about how they tracked beavers. There was a study, I think in Wisconsin, where they were tracking beavers with collars or something, and finding that they actually, some younger males will go up into the head, like higher up into the watershed, build dams, hang out, eat for like the summer, and then they'll come back down to like their family lodge for the winter. So I had never heard that before. So I think there's all kinds of like interesting social behaviors and things they do that people are just starting to understand. That's a good question. Yeah.
How much is habitat connectivity a consideration in these restoration projects? Like, it's awesome to have them restored to one area, but then if we want them to be dispersing, are you guys going to have to look at sort of habitat connectivity between complexes?
It's really important, yeah, because I think the places where you don't have connected habitat are the really vulnerable spots, not just for beavers, but for anything that's kind of moving through there. So yeah, if you have a setting where you have a lot of really good beaver habitat, but then there's a carrying capacity there for the beavers, right? There's only so much willow and alder that can grow. And then they have to cross like a few miles of, you know, really open fields or a busy highway or something like that. That definitely limits them. And so one thing that I've come away with, like as I've continued to like learn in my learning about beavers and restoration, is that you really, if you do restoration at a place where like it's hard for beavers to get to, like they might not come, but if they do come and it's not connected, it might actually be like a sink population for them. So they may be more vulnerable in that place, which may be, you know, negative overall in the population. So I think thinking about connectivity is critical. And thank you for asking that, because it was something that is, you know, like when these complexes are very connected with each other, but they also need to be connected. Like they create connectivity with themselves, but then they need to be connected to each other as well. Yeah, it's important. Yeah.
And there's over at the old Red Mill.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's not DLT land or big about
Yeah.
There used to be a large beaver farm or
Oh,
a
yeah.
series, a complex.
Totally.
Behind the mill.
Yes,
Is it not-
behind the mill,
it's not there
in
anymore?
the trails
Yeah.
for years and decades.
They built
or
a
more.
bunch of dams farther up.
Oh, had
That
that.
one got blown down, but if you hike to the back end of the property, you see.
Oh, good. Okay. I
Okay.
just wondered what was the plan, if there is one, for the
Yeah.
area right by the mill. It's kind of just a lumpy meadow now,
Yeah.
or has been.
I mean, one thing that I was kind of came away from BeaverCon with was like, and I've heard this with some restoration practitioners in Vermont who are like, like doing tree plantings along streams and then feeling really frustrated with if beavers come and like eat those trees that they planted, which I can understand like as a very quick reaction, like, oh, I did that work and now it's been eaten. To me, that's an amazing sign of success. But one thing that somebody was sharing was that they did this project. This was out in Colorado on like national forest land. They planted 5 times as many trees as they thought they needed, like to get the distribution they wanted, because they just wanted beavers to come and like eat the wood and like be there. So I wonder about like in that meadow, just doing like some kind of blitz planting. One thing that I'm finding really interesting and successful, and it kind of is a beaver mimicry technique in some ways, is live stake planting. So, I mean, that's just like easy, cheap, like you can just go and cut a bunch of willow and alder stakes, just stick them in the ground. If you have a wet meadow like that, it's a great place for them to take root. So that might, it could be fun to just try to plant a bunch of beaver food, because that's what I always think of. If beavers were there and then they're not, maybe they got killed. That definitely happens. People just go and shoot them sometimes, even if they don't own the land. It's something I don't, it's a real issue. Trapping is a thing. I don't think that would be happening. Trapping probably wouldn't be happening in Old Run Mill, but they may have just exhausted their food.
It was sort of, if you could call it vandalism, apparently some people did it on, in the cover of night or something. Blew out.
Oh, they broke the
maybe
dam.
for fun, blew out the dam that was
Okay.
near the trail entrance.
Okay.
And
Yeah. I mean, if beavers are there, they would probably just come in and start working on it again. So I wonder if beavers are not there right now. You're saying they're upstream, but maybe maybe they moved. Yeah.
There are willows right at the end of the parking lot there. I planted willows there maybe 35 years ago.
Oh,
You can take the snippets off of those, and if you want to go back farther in. But there is an establishment of stream called willow right there.
Cool.
That you can use for just what you're talking about.
Nice. Yeah. Cool. Well, I would love to invite you all, especially like if you have any beaver questions or beaver issues, or we just anything that's coming up on lands on Kikis Valley or anything like that, reach out, because we definitely want to be a resource, and and we're partnering with JULT all the time on this. Yeah.
Would you consider leading a beaver field trip where we could look at some of these wetlands?
That'd be fun.
complexes?
Yeah, I would love to.
That'd be great.
Yeah, that would be really fun. Yeah, we should think about like where are some good sites in Jericho. I mean, I love that site that I showed over just across the street off of Tillotson. It's super fun to look at. It would be fun to check that one out in the winter, because you can kind of walk on the ice. And yeah, I feel like there's some out by Tomasi Meadow, like down. I mean, I know it's not the property, but there's like, there's a bunch down there. That would be really fun too.
And
Yeah.
Wolf Run Natural Area, we have.
Wolf Run, yeah.
This is a cyclical situation.
Yes.
But the pond has beavers, and then they leave, and then they come back, and then they leave, and then they come back. And,
Yeah.
we put a beaver exclusion fence out to protect
Yes.
the culvert, which has been very successful.
Yes.
So that would be one place. And then Kikis Valley Farm, we have.
Kikis Valley has been, I mean, the beaver activity there is ramped up recently, which
Yes.
is great to see. I love seeing
Yes.
that. Yeah, you can see an amazing, just as you're driving up to Conch Hollow off of Tyler Place, there's
Right.
like,
There's a large dam.
there's a dam there, and then you
Right.
can kind of see it going back in. Yeah.
So,
Great. Well, thanks, everybody.
well, thank